You are listening He Can Who Thinks He Can by Orison Swett Marden, narrated by Litnarrate. Welcome to Litnarrate! Sit back and enjoy classic literature brought to life through narration. Here is a question. What if the only thing standing between you and the life you actually want is not money, not luck, not connections, but a single belief hiding quietly in the back of your mind? What if you have been carrying around, for years, a mental picture of yourself as smaller, weaker, less capable than you truly are? And that picture has been quietly shaping everything you attempt, everything you avoid, and everything you settle for. By the end of this episode, you are going to understand exactly how that hidden picture gets built, how it gets reinforced day after day without you noticing, and more importantly, how people who came from nothing, absolute nothing, used a handful of simple mental shifts to completely rewrite their own story. Stick with me to the end, because the final section covers the one decision that determines whether all of this becomes real change or just another motivational video you forget by tomorrow. Today we are drawing on the philosophy of a book written over a century ago called He Can Who Thinks He Can. It was written in a very different time, factories and railroads and telegraph wires, no internet, no smartphones, no social media anxiety. And yet strip away the horse carriages and gas lamps, and the core message underneath is almost eerily relevant to anyone scrolling through their phone today, feeling stuck, feeling behind, feeling like everyone else got some secret head start that they missed. The central claim of this philosophy is blunt and almost uncomfortable. Most people who fail do not fail because life was unfair to them. They fail because somewhere along the way they started believing they would fail, and that belief became a self-fulfilling prophecy that touched every decision they made afterward. Let us start with the core idea because it is deceptively simple, and like most simple ideas, people brush past it without really absorbing it. Confidence is not a nice personality trait that some lucky people are born with while the rest of us have to do without. Confidence is closer to a physical force. It is closer to electricity running through a wire. When it is present, it multiplies whatever ability you already have. When it is absent, even genuine talent gets muffled, dimmed, wasted. Think about two people with identical skill sets applying for the same opportunity. One walks in believing, on some deep level, that they belong there, that they have something valuable to offer. The other walks in silently apologizing for taking up space, expecting to be dismissed, bracing for rejection before anyone has said a word. 90% of the time, the room can feel the difference before either person opens their mouth. Confidence is not arrogance. It is not about being loud or boastful. It is about carrying yourself as someone who has already decided their contribution matters. Here is the modern version of this. Picture two job candidates on a video call interview. Same resume, same experience, same qualifications on paper. Candidate one sits with shoulders slightly slumped, voice a little hesitant, prefacing answers with phrases like, "Well, I am not totally sure, but," or "This might be a silly idea, but." Candidate 2 sits upright, speaks in complete confident sentences, and even when unsure, frames it as, "Let me think through this out loud with you." Recruiters will tell you off the record that confidence like this often outweighs a slightly stronger resume. Not because confidence guarantees skill, but because confidence signals to other people that you already believe in your own value, and human beings are wired to mirror that belief back. Now here is where this philosophy gets interesting, because it does not just say believe in yourself and vaguely hope for the best. It makes a very specific and almost scientific claim about how belief actually works inside your mind. It argues that whatever atmosphere you surround yourself with, mentally and physically, eventually seeps into you and becomes part of who you are. If you spend your days marinating in thoughts of failure, talking about your bad luck, complaining about how the odds are stacked against you, dressing the part of someone who has already given up, walking with your head down, speaking in a defeated tone, you are not just describing failure. You are rehearsing it. You are training your nervous system, your posture, your vocabulary, and eventually your actual decision-making to align with the identity of a person who loses. And the frightening part is this can happen completely unconsciously. Nobody wakes up one day and decides, today I will become a failure. It happens in tiny repeated moments, small surrenders, small complaints, small acts of self-doubt that accumulate like sediment until one day you look up and realize you have built an entire identity out of excuses. Let me bring this into a very modern, very relatable example. Think about social media comparison. Someone spends hours scrolling through other people's highlight reels, seeing vacations, promotions, new relationships, new houses, and each scroll plants a tiny seed of, I am behind, I am not enough. Everyone else figured this out except me. Repeat that scrolling behavior daily for months, and you have unconsciously built yourself an atmosphere of inadequacy. You have marinated your mind in a failure narrative, exactly the way this old philosophy warned about, just delivered through a smartphone screen instead of gossiping neighbors. The remedy the book proposes is almost radically simple. Change the atmosphere. Surround yourself deliberately and consciously with evidence of possibility rather than evidence of limitation. That might mean muting accounts that trigger comparison spirals. It might mean seeking out mentors, communities, or content that reflects the identity you are trying to grow into rather than the one you are trying to escape. Now, let us talk about something the book calls arousal, though obviously that word meant something different back then. What it really means is the spark that wakes up dormant potential inside a person. The book tells stories of people who spent decades doing perfectly ordinary work, feeling unremarkable, until one single moment or environment change lit a fire that had been sitting unused inside them the entire time. A blacksmith who never went past basic schooling, who became, later in life, a highly respected judge simply because he happened to attend one lecture about the value of education, and something clicked. A young clerk who moved to a booming, ambitious city and suddenly found himself surrounded by other hungry-driven people, and that environment pulled ambition out of him that had been sitting dormant his entire childhood. This is honestly one of the most practical, actionable ideas in the entire philosophy, and it translates perfectly into modern life. Environment is not neutral. The people you spend the most time with, the conversations you are constantly exposed to, the content you consume daily, all of this is either sharpening your ambition or slowly sanding it down into complacency. Think about the modern equivalent of moving to a booming city. It might be joining an online community of people building businesses or surrounding yourself with coworkers who are genuinely passionate about growth rather than coworkers who spend every lunch break complaining about how nothing ever changes. It might be finding one mentor, one person who believes in your potential more than you currently believe in it yourself, because that external belief can sometimes plant the very first seed that eventually grows into self-belief. Here is a challenge worth sitting with for a moment. Think honestly about the 5 people or 5 sources of content you interact with most in an average week. Are they expanding your sense of what is possible for your life? Or are they quietly reinforcing a smaller, more limited version of who you could become? This is not about abandoning people who are struggling or judging anyone for where they currently are in life. It is about recognizing that ambition is contagious, just like this old philosophy claims, and so is stagnation. If you are constantly around people who have stopped growing, stopped dreaming, stopped trying new things, some part of you will start to believe that stopping is simply what adults eventually do. And if you deliberately place yourself around people who are still stretching, still building, still failing forward, some part of you will start to believe that is simply what capable people do too. Let us move into another core pillar of this philosophy, one that feels almost radical in our current culture of instant gratification. The book insists that education, real growth of the mind, does not require a formal institution or a certain number of years sitting in a classroom. It insists that the world itself is a university and that anyone with genuine curiosity can absorb an incredible education simply through disciplined observation, reading in spare moments, and deliberately seeking out people who know more than they do. This was written at a time when college was a privilege reserved for a small sliver of society, and the author was essentially saying, do not let your lack of formal credentials convince you that you cannot become deeply, genuinely educated. Translate that into today's world, and the message becomes even more powerful, honestly, because we now live in an era with more free, high-quality educational content available at our fingertips than any generation in human history has ever had access to. Someone without a college degree today can access world-class instruction on virtually any subject imaginable, absolutely free, simply by being willing to seek it out during the spare minutes. Most people waste scrolling mindlessly. The philosophy specifically warns against wasting what it calls the odds and ends of time, those small 15-minute pockets throughout a day, waiting in line, commuting, sitting in a waiting room, that most people fill with mindless distraction. It argues that a person who consistently uses those small pockets of time for genuine learning will, over the span of years, quietly out-educate people who went through formal schooling, but stopped learning the moment they received their diploma. Think about how many people today spend their commute scrolling through short, entertaining videos with zero lasting value versus the relatively small percentage who use that same commute to listen to something that actually builds their skills or knowledge. Over 10 years, the compounding difference between those two habits is staggering. It is not about being joyless or never relaxing. It is about recognizing that small, consistent choices, repeated across years, quietly determine who becomes remarkable and who stays exactly where they started. Now, here is a theme in this old philosophy that feels genuinely ahead of its time, and it revolves around freedom, specifically freedom from anything that drains your energy, entangles your finances, or keeps you dependent in ways that quietly strangle your ambition. The book argues that before anyone can achieve anything significant, they need to first identify and eliminate whatever is silently sabotaging their progress. It uses the image of a runner who wants to win a race but refuses to remove excess weight, refuses to train off unnecessary baggage, and then wonders why they cannot compete with runners who prepared properly. This translates beautifully into modern financial and lifestyle advice. Think about consumer debt as one of the clearest modern examples of this exact same principle. Someone racks up high-interest debt buying things to look successful, and within a few years they are working simply to service that debt, with almost no ability to take entrepreneurial risks, pursue further education, or leave a toxic job because they are financially chained to obligations that were entirely avoidable. The old philosophy specifically warns against exactly this pattern, describing men who spent their entire working lives, quote, clearing up old debts that came from bad judgment, unquote, always trying to catch up rather than ever getting ahead. That warning, written well over 100 years ago, describes the exact financial trap that swallows countless people today through credit cards, lifestyle inflation, and the pressure to keep up appearances on social media. There is also a fascinating and honestly quite bold section of this philosophy dealing with career choice and personal integrity. The author argues, quite forcefully, that no amount of money is worth taking a job or building a business around something that violates your own sense of right and wrong. Not because of some abstract moral lecture, but because of a very practical psychological consequence. He claims that a person cannot fully respect themselves, and therefore cannot fully perform at their best, while doing work that some part of them privately considers dishonest or exploitative. He describes people trapped in what he calls questionable occupations, making decent money but privately hating what they do, ashamed to tell friends the details of their job, constantly rationalizing that they will quit once they have saved enough, a promise they keep making to themselves for years without ever following through. Think about how relevant this remains today. Consider people working in industries built around manipulation, whether that is predatory sales tactics, misleading marketing, or business models that quietly exploit vulnerable customers. Many of these people privately know something feels wrong, yet they stay because the paycheck is comfortable and leaving feels risky. This old philosophy would argue that this discomfort is not something to numb or ignore. It is a signal, a compass, pointing toward the fact that long-term fulfillment and long-term self-respect are being slowly traded away for short-term financial comfort. And the warning is blunt. Making money through work you privately despise is bad business, no matter how profitable it looks from the outside, because the corrosion it causes to your self-image eventually outweighs whatever the paycheck provided. Let us pivot now to happiness, because this old philosophy has something genuinely counterintuitive to say about it, something that feels startlingly relevant to a culture obsessed with luxury, status, and material accumulation. The author observed in his own time incredibly wealthy men who had everything society told them would create happiness, mansions, servants, elaborate meals, and yet were miserable, anxious, and in some documented cases completely broken the moment their public reputation or financial empire started to crumble. His conclusion was that happiness is never actually found inside material accumulation. It is found in the alignment between your actions and your own sense of honesty and usefulness. He argues that a dishonest fortune can never produce genuine peace, because some part of the mind, which he describes almost like an internal witness, continues quietly disapproving of wrongdoing regardless of how much external luxury surrounds a person. This maps almost perfectly onto modern psychological research on wealth and happiness, which consistently shows that beyond a certain baseline covering basic needs and reasonable comfort, additional income produces diminishing returns on actual life satisfaction. Meanwhile, studies on well-being consistently point toward relationships, purpose, and a sense of contributing something meaningful as the real drivers of long-term happiness. The old philosophy essentially predicted this finding over a century before modern researchers proved it with data. He specifically criticizes what he calls chasing happiness, as if it were a separate pursuit from doing good, honest, useful work, insisting instead that genuine contentment is what he calls a reflection, an echo, a natural byproduct of living with integrity and purpose, rather than something you can directly hunt down through spending or status seeking. There is also a wonderfully practical warning buried in here about idleness, and honestly, this section feels almost like it was written specifically for anyone who has ever fantasized about winning the lottery and never working again. The author argues that human beings were built for activity, for striving, for the satisfaction of using their abilities toward something meaningful, and that a person who is permanently freed from the need to work without ever choosing meaningful activity to replace that necessity tends to deteriorate rather than flourish. He describes wealthy young men, born into fortunes they never earned, who privately admitted they knew idleness was ruining them, yet found themselves paralyzed, unable to summon the motivation to build anything meaningful, because the spur of necessity had been removed before they ever developed the internal discipline to replace it. This connects beautifully to modern conversations about retirement psychology and what researchers now call the retirement crisis of purpose. People who spend decades imagining that a life of pure leisure will finally make them happy often discover, once they actually stop working entirely, that the absence of purposeful activity creates a strange kind of emptiness rather than the relief they expected. The old philosophy essentially argued this exact point generations before modern psychology caught up to it. Happiness, it claims, and usefulness are, quote, born twins, and separating them is fatal, unquote. In other words, you cannot manufacture lasting satisfaction purely through rest and consumption. You need something to build, something to contribute, something that requires your genuine effort and attention. Now let us talk about one of the more empowering ideas buried in this philosophy, the concept that responsibility is actually one of the most powerful tools for developing hidden capability. The author uses the metaphor of an explosive that requires enormous pressure before it reveals its true destructive, or in this case, constructive power. He argues that most people go through life never discovering their actual capabilities, because they are never placed under enough pressure or responsibility to force those capabilities to the surface. He tells stories of ordinary employees who suddenly found themselves running entire operations after unexpected circumstances forced responsibility onto them, and who discovered, almost to their own shock, that they were fully capable the entire time. They simply never had the opportunity or the necessity to prove it. This is an incredibly relevant lesson for anyone hesitant to accept a promotion, start a business, or take on a leadership role because of self-doubt. The honest truth is that competence very often develops after you accept the responsibility, not before. Waiting until you feel fully ready is often waiting for a feeling that will never fully arrive, because confidence in a new role typically gets built through the actual experience of handling that role, not through endless preparation beforehand. Think about new parents. Almost nobody feels fully ready before their first child arrives, yet the responsibility itself forces a rapid, often surprising development of patience, problem solving, and resourcefulness that simply did not exist beforehand. Think about someone thrown into a leadership position during a crisis at work, someone who never saw themselves as a leader, who discovers reserves of calm decision-making they never knew they possessed, precisely because the situation demanded it and there was nobody else available to step up. The book also spends meaningful time on originality, and this section feels remarkably relevant in a modern world obsessed with imitation, trends, and copying whatever went viral last week. The author argues quite forcefully that no human being ever achieved lasting success by trying to become a carbon copy of someone else, even if that someone else was genuinely successful. Success, he insists, cannot be copied because it is deeply personal, built from an individual combination of strengths, timing, and authentic voice. He warns against what he calls hidebound intellects, people so attached to doing things exactly the way they have always been done, that they become allergic to any new idea, terrified of anything without a comfortable precedent. Bring this into a modern context, and you will see this pattern everywhere in business and content creation. Countless companies and creators try to copy whatever strategy worked for someone else last year, only to discover the market has already moved on, or that audiences can sense the lack of authenticity in something that feels like a knockoff rather than an original voice. Meanwhile, the businesses and creators who build lasting success tend to be the ones willing to take the slightly uncomfortable risk of doing something in their own distinct way, even when there is no existing playbook to follow. The old philosophy argues this is not just a nice creative preference. It is a competitive advantage because originality attracts attention in a way that imitation never can, precisely because human beings instinctively notice and respond to authenticity. Let us bring all of this together now, because there is a common thread running through every single one of these ideas, and it is worth naming directly. This entire philosophy rests on the belief that your external circumstances are far less powerful in determining your future than your internal mental posture, the beliefs you rehearse daily, the environment you deliberately choose to surround yourself with, and your willingness to take on responsibility before you feel fully ready. None of this denies that real obstacles exist. Poverty is real, discrimination is real, bad luck happens to good people. The book is not naively pretending otherwise. What it insists, quite persuasively when you look at the historical examples, is that among people who faced genuinely difficult circumstances, the ones who eventually rose above them almost always shared a specific mental pattern. They refused to let their current circumstances define their permanent identity. They treated poverty, ignorance, or difficult starts as a temporary condition to be worked through, rather than a life sentence to be endlessly explained and complained about. Here is the practical challenge I want to leave you with, because understanding these ideas intellectually means absolutely nothing if they do not change a single thing about how you actually live tomorrow morning. Pick one area of your life right now where you have been quietly rehearsing failure. Maybe it is a business idea you have talked yourself out of a dozen times. Maybe it is a difficult conversation you have been avoiding because you have convinced yourself it will go badly. Maybe it is a skill you assume you are simply not talented enough to develop. Whatever it is, I want you to notice the internal language you use around it. Are you saying, I am not the kind of person who succeeds at this, or are you saying, I have not yet figured out how to succeed at this? That tiny shift in language from a permanent identity statement to a temporary process statement is not just motivational fluff. It fundamentally changes what your brain considers possible, and it opens the door to actually trying, rather than preemptively giving up before you have even attempted the first step. The second practical action is to audit your environment, honestly and specifically. Look at the 5 accounts, 5 people, or 5 habits that occupy the most mental real estate in your daily life, and ask whether they are expanding your sense of what is achievable or quietly shrinking it. You do not need to make a dramatic disrupt change overnight. Start small. Replace one mindless scrolling habit with 15 minutes of genuine learning in a subject you actually care about. Reach out to one person whose ambition and growth inspire you, rather than drain you. Notice over the following weeks how these small shifts begin altering the atmosphere you are marinating in, exactly the way this old philosophy predicted over a century ago. And finally, the third action, perhaps the most uncomfortable one. Take an honest look at any area of your life where you privately know something feels dishonest or misaligned with your values, whether that is in your career, your relationships, or how you present yourself to others. This philosophy would argue that no amount of external success can fully compensate for that internal discomfort, and that genuine confidence, the real unshakable kind, can only be built on a foundation of integrity. You cannot fake self-respect. You either earn it through honest effort, or you spend your life quietly managing the discomfort of knowing you have not. The core lesson of this entire philosophy, stripped down to its simplest form, is this. Belief is not a passive feeling that either exists or does not exist inside you by accident of birth. Belief is something you actively construct, day by day, through the environment you choose, the responsibilities you accept before you feel ready, the honest work you commit to even when nobody is watching, and the internal language you use when describing yourself and your possibilities. He can who thinks he can, and just as importantly, he cannot who thinks he cannot. That is not simply a motivational slogan from over 100 years ago. It is a description of a psychological mechanism that continues operating inside every single person listening to this right now, whether you have noticed it or not. The only question left is what you choose to do with that awareness starting today. Thank you for listening to Litnarrate. If you enjoyed this classic tale, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more timeless literature brought to life through narration. See you in the next story.